Chapter 16, ABC, from Peak by Roland Smith. The next morning I poked my head through the tent flap. Crystal clear, 28 degrees, no wind, by far the best weather we'd had since getting to base camp, and I could not have been more disappointed. I had a sore throat, and it felt like the muscles and joints inside my skin had been replaced with broken glass. Sunho was sitting outside waiting for me, dressed in my former clothes, including my so-called junk boots. And there was an added touch. The Peak Experience logo had been sewn on both the parka and his stocking cap. I thought Zopa had traded all that stuff away. Why was Sunho wearing my clothes? "You do not look well," he said. "I do not feel well," I croaked back at him. "What's with the clothes?" "They didn't fit you," he answered. "Zopa gave them to me." I was too out of it to pursue it any further. I reached back into my tent for my water bottle and found it was frozen solid. I was so tired the night before, I had forgotten to put it in the sleeping bag with me to keep it from freezing. I had spent hours packing and repacking my gear for the trip up to ABC. Sunho pulled his water bottle out of his backpack. I took a deep swig and handed it back, wondering why he had a backpack. "Are you going up to ABC with us?" "Yes," he answered, "and I would like to leave before the herders. I don't like stepping in yak dung." And this picture here, this is a picture of a yak. "Me either," I said, although I had never seen yak dung. The porters kept yaks corralled at the far end of the camp. I hadn't been over there yet, but you could sure smell the shaggy bovines when the wind blew from the direction. I wondered why Zopa hadn't mentioned Sunho going up to ABC with us the night before. But I was too tired, hungry, and worried about the climb to ask Sunho about it right then. "Guess we'd better try to wake up Holly." "She and Zopa have already left," Sunho said. I looked at my watch in a panic, but it was only 9 o'clock. "When did they leave?" "2 hours ago." "Why didn't Zopa wake me up?" I asked, although I was glad for the extra sleep. "Miss Holly is a slow climber. We will overtake them." I grabbed my gear and checked it one last time. Then we went over to the mess tent to get something to eat. The only person inside was the cook. I was disappointed Josh wasn't there to see me off. But considering what he had been through the past few days, I couldn't blame him for sleeping in. Halfway through my breakfast, JR, Will, and Jack dragged in blurry-eyed and irritable, but after half an hour of coffee and carbs, they began to perk up. "Oh, let's get this over with," Will said, smearing glacial cream on his face to prevent it from burning. At first, it appeared that Holly was a faster climber than Sunho thought. But her speed was explained a few hours later, when we finally caught up to her near a stream of glacial meltwater. Zopa had been carrying both his and Holly's heavy backpack as they made their way up the steep glacier. Even without the backpack, she was having a hard time catching her breath. She tried to smile when she saw us, but couldn't quite manage it. Zopa looked a little haggard, too, which wasn't too surprising considering he was carrying as much weight as a yak. Speaking of which, the yak herd had been gaining on us all day long, and we're now less than 100 yards behind. Each yak carried over 100 pounds of supplies and their own fodder. There was nothing else for them to eat this high. With a grim expression, Zopa looked at the long line of animals. I guess he didn't want to trudge through their dung any more than we did. "Those cows are going to ruin our shots," JR said. "They're not cows, they're yaks," I said, "and how are they going to ruin your shots? We're filming you, not a bunch of herders and their yaks." I thought that at 19,000 feet, all my hot buttons were out of reach. But JR had just managed to punch one of them dead center. I hated television documentaries where they filmed the intrepid scientist, climber, or explorer in the middle of some dreadfully hostile environment, all alone. Oh yeah? Then who's operating the camera as they battle the elements all alone? Back at base camp, I had overheard climbers complaining about the filthy porters and herders and their stinking yaks. When something was missing from one of the camps, the porters and herders were always the first suspects. Sure, I didn't want to step in yak dung, but it was pretty humbling to hear those same herders and porters in their cheap boots, ratty clothes, and heavy packs coming up behind us with the strength and breath to whistle, chant, and sing as they hauled our gear up the mountain. None of us were whistling or singing, and we were carrying a tenth of what they had on their backs. So he's mad because a lot of the climbers, they basically look down on all the porters, the Sherpas, everyone who's like carrying all the stuff up, and they're treating them badly. Like they blame them if something gets stolen. They blame them if something goes wrong. It's always their fault because they treat them like they're less than other people. Without those herders, yaks, and porters, we wouldn't be here, I said to JR. Leaving them out of the film is like leaving Everest out of the film. They're more important to a climber getting to the summit than the climber. I didn't have enough breath for any more, but I think I made my point because Zopa laughed, long and hard, which is hard to do at that altitude. And when the yaks and herders and porters reached us, JR filmed the entire procession crossing the stream, including the bloody spots in the snow left by the yaks that had cut their hooves on sharp rocks. We gladly followed their dung trail all the way up to the intermediate camp. The camp wasn't exactly what I expected. It was located at the very edge of an unstable cliff above a roaring glacial river. So they're at the intermediate camp. So you got base camp, and then you've got intermediate camp, and then you've got camp 2, and then ABC. It was located at the very edge of an unstable cliff above a roaring glacial river. Behind us was a slope that looked like it was going to come tumbling down on top of us. I pointed out these two potential disasters to Zopa, and as an exclamation mark, a boulder popped loose and came tumbling down the slope, sliding to a stop about 50 feet from where we were standing. It's level, Zopa said, as if a comfortable sleep were all that mattered before we were crushed to death. I looked around at the others. None of them seemed bothered, but that might have been because they were so exhausted they could barely move. I knew exactly how they felt. The simplest tasks seemed to take forever, and we weren't even up at ABC yet. There were 3 higher camps above that. After setting up our tent, Sunho and I had decided to bunk together so we didn't have to carry up an extra tent. We set up Holly's. She hadn't uttered a single word since we'd caught up to her. She was sitting slumped on a flat rock like a puppet with its strings cut, watching us through the dull, lifeless eyes. Sunho went to help Zopa and the other Sherpas get dinner ready, and I walked over and asked Holly how she was doing. She took several deep breaths, and on the last exhale managed a wheezy, "Fine." At sea level, anyone who looked like she did would be in the back of an ambulance on their way to an emergency. But at 19,028 feet, the emergency threshold was proportionally higher. Even so, I didn't like Holly's chances for getting any farther up the mountain in the condition she was in. A shot of O's, which is oxygen, would have perked her right up, but it would also defeat the purpose of acclimatization. Her body was actually climbing as she was slumped on the cold rock, which was the whole purpose of the climb. Climb high, sleep low. Red blood cells are multiplying by the millions to protect our bodies from the thin air. These new red cells stick around during the rest periods at lower altitudes, making it easier next time you go up. So even though... Shut up, Peak, Holly managed to say with a smile. What? I know how red blood cells work. I stared down at her completely dumbfounded until I realized that somewhere in the middle of my thoughts, I had started talking out loud without realizing it, which should give you an idea of what kind of shape I was in. So if you didn't understand that, basically the way it works is when you go up high to these high altitudes, there's not as much oxygen for your lungs, And so your body builds up extra red blood cells to help compensate for that. And then when you go back down the mountain where there's more oxygen, well, your body still has all those red blood cells. And so then you go up higher again, you've got all those extra red blood cells, and your body starts to make more red blood cells again. And you continue doing that, so you build up this stockpile of extra red blood cells in your system that helps you breathe. I stared at her, completely dumbfounded, until I realized that somewhere in the middle of my thoughts... Oh, I read that. Sorry. Holly nodded. Help me to my tent. When I got her up, she swayed, but a couple of shallow breaths steadied her. It took us a good 5 minutes to walk the 15 feet to the tent, and by the time we got there, we were both gasping. It felt like somebody had cut my strings. What was happening to me? I deposited Holly in her tent, then slowly made my way over to Sunho and Zopa, wondering if I was going to make it there without collapsing. Zopa handed me a cup. I took it from him, but I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with it. Drink, he said. Oh, yeah, I thought sluggishly. A cup. You drink from it. The first sip flowed down my esophagus and hit my belly like some kind of magic elixir. Oh, what is this stuff? Zopa stared at me. Tea, he said, with sugar. What kind of tea? Plain old green tea. He reached into the inside pocket of my Gore-Tex coat, pulled out my water bottle, and shook it. It was nearly full. So tea is kind of something that comes up again and again, this nice, hot, warm tea that warms you up. Dehydration, he said. You are not drinking enough. This will kill you faster than the thin air. He nodded toward Sunho, who also had his hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Sunho was guilty too. I hadn't felt thirsty all day, but I knew Zopa was right. If you waited to drink until you were thirsty, this altitude, it might be too late. Holly, I said with alarm, thinking she was suffering from dehydration too. Zopa shook his head. Miss Holly has had plenty of fluids, he said. I made certain. She's not doing well, I said. I have seen worse, Zopa said, and some of those made it to the summit. You can never tell who the mountain will allow and who it will not. So Zopa does this a lot, where he talks about the mountain kind of like it's a person deciding who's going to climb up him and who's not, and who is going to be able to succeed and who is not. And so they do these religious ceremonies to help honor the mountain so that the mountain will let them climb up. So there are all these connections that Zopa makes to the mountain, almost like it's a real person. I had a miserable night. I went a little overboard in my hydration and had to get up 3 times to pee. Then it seemed that every time I started to doze off, a boulder from the slope let loose, causing me to sit up in terror as I waited for it to crush us. But the worst problem was my throat. By morning, it felt like I had a hard-boiled goose egg lodged in it. With all my tossing and turning and peeing, I don't imagine that Sunho got much sleep either. But he didn't complain. On a bright note, the morning was as mild as the previous morning, and Holly was much improved. She managed to walk to the mess tent to have breakfast with us. The night before, Zopa had served her dinner in her tent. The herders and yaks left an hour before we did. They would go straight up to ABC without stopping at Camp 2, which should give you some idea of the kind of shape they were in compared to us. JR came up as I was packing the tent and said he wanted to do an interview with me before we headed up. Sunho and Zopa were packing up Holly's gear. I had already done several of these interviews down at base camp, and I dreaded doing any more. I had discovered that a camera in my face and a microphone boom dangling above my head turned me into a babbling idiot. Just act natural, JR would say. Be yourself. Right. Then he would give me little prompts like, what's it feel like to be on the world's greatest mountain with your dad? Or, how does being up on Everest compare to climbing skyscrapers? I would try to answer the questions with straightforward honesty and end up spewing forth the most incredibly lame answers imaginable. I stopped packing and joined the crew, trying not to look too glum. They had positioned the camera in front of the rotting slope, and I was up all night listening to the slope belch boulders. Will made me squat, pulling the hood off my head so they could see my face, and wiped off all my glacier cream, which I had just carefully applied. Man, wouldn't it be great if one of those big boulders let loose while we were doing this, Jack said. He was a sound guy and was always hoping that something horrible would happen when the film was rolling. Okay, JR said. We're going to keep it real simple today. I just want you to repeat what you said yesterday about the yaks and porters. That was really poignant, and you were absolutely right. I don't know if they'll use it in the final version, but they sure ought to. I was thrilled. In fact, during my sleepless night, I had thought about what I said and wished they'd had the camera rolling. JR gave the cue. On 3, 2, 1, tape rolling. I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. We're rolling, JR said impatiently. The camera batteries didn't last long in cold weather. I tried again, but nothing came out. Anytime, Peak. A boulder's coming loose, Jack said excitedly. Come on, Peak. I pointed to my mouth and shook my head. My voice was gone. JR swore. That boulder's ready to pop, Jack said. I think it's going to miss us, but it will definitely be in the frame. Zopa, JR yelled. Can you come over for a little stand-up? Zopa shook his head and pointed at Sunho. Let Sunho do it. Get out of the frame, Peak, JR shouted. I moved, and Sunho quickly stepped into my place. We're still rolling, JR said. Talk about your feelings towards the mountain, Sunho. Maybe something about your father? On 3, 2, 1. My father came to Sagarmatha when he was my age, Sunho said in his cool accent. He started as a porter and worked his way up to become a Sherpa and an assistant Sirdar. He told me that he climbed mountains, so I would not have to, but I think there was more to it than this. The boulder Jack hoped would fall did, along with a ton of other debris. Sunho did not flinch or even glance behind him at the mini avalanche. He just kept talking, and JR kept filming. My father was a stranger to me, but here on the mountain, I am getting to know him through the conversations of the Sherpas and climbers and porters. I came here to see the mountain, but what I'm discovering is my father. Beautiful, JR said. Wow, that was deep. Way to go, Sunho. It was beautiful, and I hate to admit it, but I was a little jealous of Sunho's smooth performance. Unlike me, he was totally comfortable in front of the video camera. JR had never praised me after a taping. Of course, I was lousy at it, but still. Jack and Will were patting Sunho on the back, telling him what a natural he was. I walked back to our tent and finished packing. I don't think they realized I had left. At mid-morning, the weather turned, with gray clouds coming in from the west and a bitterly cold wind blowing down the mountain. We had to stop and put on more layers of clothes. I covered my face with a silk balaclava and wool scarf. My throat was no better, but I trudged on, one step at a time, stopping every half hour, unwinding my shroud to drink and gagging on every gulp. Zopa walked behind us, still carrying Holly's load, and gently coaxing her up the slope as if he were her personal Sherpa or something. I didn't know if she had hired him or promised to give money to the Tibetan monks, or if it was something else, but without him, she would have been going downhill instead of up. It took us 8 hours, half a mile an hour, to get to Camp 2. There were so many climbers there, we barely had room to pitch our tents. Some of the climbers were climbing down from Camp 4 above ABC. Some were on their way up to ABC, and some were using the site as their base camp, which was hard to imagine because I could barely breathe. The film crew had to set up their tents on the far side of the camp from us. The camp was at the junction of two glaciers, East Rongbuk and Beifang. You couldn't see the Everest summit from the camp, but there was a spectacular view of the three other Himalayan peaks, Changsi, Changshan, and Lixin. So with words like that, when I come across those, I don't know how to pronounce them all the time, so I just try my best. And honestly, with something like this, nobody's going to know if you pronounce it correctly in your head or not. So just try your best. There wasn't enough room to set up the mess tent, so we were on our own for dinner. I got the stove going while Sun Ho walked down to a glacial pond to get water. By the time he got back, it had started snowing. We put the water on the stove and waited for it to boil, which was taking longer and longer the higher we climbed. I wasn't hungry, and I don't think Sun Ho was either, but we both knew we had to eat. Sun Ho asked me how I was doing. I tried to answer, but all that came out was a hissing croak. It didn't bother me that I couldn't talk. What worried me more was that the sore throat might be the beginning of something worse. There was a nasty virus going through base camp that had everyone in an uproar. If you catch something bad enough, your climb is over. As a result, the teams had circled the wagons by staying in their camps and suspiciously eyeing the approach of other climbers as if they were plague carriers. Typically, one of the porters was accused of bringing the virus to camp. Of course, one of the porters, because they're not important enough, I guess. So, of course, they're the ones that get blamed. As if the climbers were incapable of carrying a virus to Everest. As we waited for the water to boil, we watched Zopa set up Holly's tent, which she crawled into as soon as it was up. He then put up his own tent and started making their dinner. I was talking to one of the other climbers, Sun Ho said. He told me that tomorrow will be a big test. He's been up to ABC and has spent one night up at Camp 4. He said if we make it that far, we should be able to make it to the summit. I should have been paying more attention to what Sun Ho was saying, but at that moment, I was having a minor crisis that had nothing to do with my sore throat. What was causing the meltdown was the fact that it had been a relatively easy day, but I was a complete wreck. You can never tell who the mountain will allow and who it will not. Zopa's words had been echoing in my brain all day, and I was betting that Peak Marcella was in the not crowd, right beside George with the clogged heart and Francis of the Gamma bag. Dr. Wu had been wrong about my conditioning, or else I had screwed myself up by getting dehydrated. But if that was the case, why wasn't Sun Ho suffering? I looked over at him. He was stirring the pot, chattering away like we were camped on a beach. So again, you kind of get the sense that Peak's getting a little jealous. And I'm also wondering, like, is he going to make it to the top? The next morning, Zopa dragged us out of our tent before dawn. There was about a foot of new snow on the ground, but it had stopped falling. Hard climb today, he said. We need to get up fast, or there won't be a place to pitch our tents. How's your throat? I shook my head. My voice was still gone, but I didn't feel any worse than I had the night before, which I considered a victory. Outside camp, we started up the trough, a depression that sits between two rows of jagged ice pinnacles that look like giant canine teeth. The main path was well worn and clearly marked by the yaks. Zopa warned us to stay on the path. If you wander off it, even to take a pee, you could be lost forever in the ice maze. I promise this is the last time I'm going to talk about high-altitude bodily functions. Answering a call of nature on the mountain is a huge ordeal. Because at that altitude, you can't do anything fast. You have to take off layer after layer of clothing. It can delay your climb by a half hour or more, which can ruin your chances of getting higher because bad weather moves in so quickly. This is why you try to take care of all of this before you leave camp. About noon, we ran into the porters, yaks, and herders, heading back down to base camp. They were still whistling and singing, and I was tempted to get in line with them. I think the only thing that stopped me was that Holly had been in front of me all day long, and I wasn't about to let her get any higher up the mountain than me. 2 hours later, we got our first look at ABC. Sun Ho pointed out the tiny colored tents in the distance, but the camp wasn't as close as it looked. It was 3 more torturous hours away. The only bright spot was that Sun Ho and I managed to pass Holly and Zopa about 100 yards before they reached the camp. ABC, 21,161 feet, higher than Kilimanjaro and Mount McKinley, and I felt it. The crude camp made every other place we had stayed seem like paradise. It was situated on a pile of rubble between a glacier that looked like it had been formed by frozen sewage and a rotten rock wall. The ground was littered with ankle-breaking rocks and life-ending crevices. All right, so as you can see in the picture here, this is a picture of ABC, the camp, with all the tents there. That's described in this. That's the actual ABC. It's a real place on Everest. So that's an actual picture of what it looks like in real life. JR filmed our triumphant arrival. I barely had the strength even to look at the camera as I trudged to buy it. There were only about 6 tents set up, so there was plenty of room for us to stake out an area for the team. Unlike at base camp, people weren't wandering around socializing. They were either too pooped to move or terrified about twisting something this close to the top. By the time Zopa and Holly arrived, we had our tents set up and a fire going from the wood the porters had left. "How's your throat?" Holly asked. Sun Ho and I nearly fell off the rocks we were sitting on. This was the first full sentence she had put together since we left base camp, and her voice almost sounded normal. We had passed her, but she seemed in better shape than we were. "It's still sore," I said with difficulty. "I think there's a doctor up here," she said. "I'll go find him." By the time we had her tent up, she was back with the doctor in tow. He looked like he needed a doctor himself, but he examined my throat, then called Leah Krieger down at base camp. They decided to put me on antibiotics. Josh came on the radio and asked me how it was going. I couldn't answer, so I turned over the radio to Holly, who gave a glowing report. Josh said they were heading up to ABC, then to Camp 4 for a night, and would no doubt see us on our way down. I should mention something about the radios here. The frequencies were wide open, and people had nothing better to do than sit in their tents and monitor the chatter. This included Captain Sheck and the soldiers. As a result, everyone was careful about what they talked about, especially expedition leaders like Josh. So Captain Sheck is listening into the radio, hearing if anybody is doing anything bad, so he can go kick them off the mountain, because that's what he loves to do. He's a bad dude. He wants to make sure that, he doesn't want them to succeed. He just wants to kick them off if he can. The next day was basically spent lying in our tents, trying to breathe, hoping that our red blood cells were doing what they were supposed to be doing. When we moved, it was in slow motion, like we were on the moon. You'd get a plate of food and stare at it, thinking a couple of minutes had passed, and tell yourself you should try to eat before it cooled off. Fork to mouth, ice cold. Huh? Look at watch. Half an hour? How? By the morning we left, the antibiotics had kicked in and my throat was better. I even managed to croak out a couple of understandable sentences. Sun Ho, on the other hand, wasn't feeling good. He had spent a good deal of the night vomiting outside her tent door. Every time he puked, Zopa would come over and make him drink, worried about dehydration. I felt bad for him, but to be honest, his getting sick perked me up a little. Terrible, I know. I felt better knowing that I wasn't the only one having a difficult time. The 3-day trip up took us 9 hours to complete on the way down. We ran into Josh between the first and second camps. He asked how my throat was, then continued toward ABC, shouting down to us that he would see us in a few days. Holly not only carried her backpack on the way down, she beat us to base camp by half an hour. You can never tell who the mountain will allow and who it will not. That last sentence is repeated a couple of times in the chapter, so I'm wondering, what does that mean? And that is the end of the chapter.